From 1607 to 1776, the American colonists were demoralized and mistreated by the British, until they rebelled in 1775 and fought for what was theirs. Not once did King George listen to the cries and suggestions from the English. Instead, he replied with more laws and acts that restricted the rights of the English. The Americans were completely justified to rebel against the troublesome British due to the unlawful acts done by King George. This led to their independence. A big problem the colonists were very upset about were the taxes they had to pay due to King George trying to get out of his debt because of the French and Indian War. King George had just fought a war that the colonists had started and wanted to tax colonists to pay back for the funds lost during the war the colonists had started. He taxed the colonists very heavily. King George had many different types of taxes like the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Townshend Acts, and the Quartering Act. These were major acts passed by the Parliament. These acts all taxed colonists on everyday items including paper, tea, glass products, molasses, and lead. The Quartering Act forced British soldiers to live in colonist homes, provide them with bedding and food, and whatever else they needed. This act was thought to be the same thing as a tax since it forces colonists to spend more on products for the soldiers. But most of these acts were vetoed due to protests of colonists. Some protests included riots, tar and feathering, and destructive letters sent to the king. Colonists were not getting representation in Parliament. When the English were still under British control, in the English Bill of Rights it states that any citizen under the English power has representation. But this wasn't the case for the colonists. The British did not let the colonists elect their own representatives in Parliament. This is an act of tyranny. King George simply thought that the colonies did not need representations because they were already represented by the British citizens, who didn't get a vote, or towns that did not get a vote either. This was an unfair act that King George did because the colonists were still his citizens, so they should have gotten at least a representative in Parliament. Although with no representation in Parliament, no British leaders stood up for the colonies.
We wouldn't be here without the Revolutionary War, and I've gone back recently in my own personal readings to try to understand more about that, how brave they were, and they were not just brave in a military sense, they were intellectually brave.
The people who were in the forefront of the revolution were people engaged in commerce because they felt most specifically and directly British interference, British taxation and limitations.
It's very interesting to think about the foundation of the nation and the fact that the country was born out of revolution, and that sort of rallying spirit of win, win, win and fight back the oppressors persists.
We were effectively guerrilla fighters. We were not the Redcoats, after all.
Two things. Number one, memo to the British forces, ixnay on the red suits. That was probably not tactically the best move. Number two, if you're going up against guys who are using blankets for shoes in the middle of winter, bring your best game, because they'll open a can of early American whoop-ass on you.
The American Revolution, in one sense, is an example of a war in which the weaker contestant prevails because it is more determined to persevere.
It's almost the little man syndrome. We've always felt a little undersized, a little underappreciated, and I think whenever you're able to take those feelings and manifest them and to try to do something that's positive, to try to do something that's competitive, you give yourself a lot better chance of being successful.
The British Army was fighting for a king. The Americans were fighting for their lives. And it's not so much how much equipment you have or how much training you have, it's what's in your belly, it's what's in your heart. And you know you're fighting for your lives in a way of life, as opposed to fighting for a monarch who you may not care about or may not love, but it's your job. That's all the difference. You're going to fight harder if you're fighting for your own way of life, you're fighting for your families.
Back then, during the Revolutionary War, what really made the difference is they really believed in what they were fighting for. That's why the Americans actually had the advantage.
This is a case of hanging on in the face of the British actions long enough to where the British literally would grow weary of this and realize that it was endless, they could not prevail.
In the last analysis, the British were willing to cut a deal with the Americans in order to make sure that they could preserve their power in Europe.
Any American who wants to know what it takes to be free should study the Revolutionary War.
The British didn't want compromise with the colonists. Throughout all the taxes and unnecessary deaths, King George never once listened to what the colonists had to say. He instead just added more taxes and treated the colonists as if they were his toys. This was the huge factor to the rage that had been pent up in the colonists for years. One of the most important and historical documents this country has, the Declaration of Independence, wasn't even read by King George. He instead just raged war without reading a single word the colonists had to say. He even made acts to make the colonists behave, such as the Intolerable Acts. He only made this act in response to the Boston Tea Party. This act closed the Boston Harbor, closing out all trade with any foreign country. Although this isn't one way to set things straight, the colonists couldn't have thrived without any business and resources. Ultimately, the Americans were justified to rebel against the British unlawful acts. Colonists were largely taxed on everyday products, colonists were also not getting representatives in Parliament, and in whole, King George never once tried to compromise with the colonists. In final analysis, the impacts of the Revolutionary War was Americans could be independent from England and become their own society. They could also now have their own laws, government, currency, and could spread further west, settle, and thrive.